Imagine living in America for 25 years, and one wrong gesture drags you back into a past you've spent a lifetime outrunning. It was a calm morning in Judge Caprio's courtroom, one of those days when small fines roll by like gentle waves, a woman disputing a parking ticket, a young man apologizing for his expired meter. Light laughter here and there, nothing unusual. Then the clerk called the next case. Alexei Miller, 58, cited for aggressive parking and disorderly conduct. A man stepped forward, and the hum of the room thinned instantly. He moved with measured certainty, a kind of quiet dominance that didn't need to be announced. His shoulders were straight, the chin slightly raised, as though he weren't entering a courtroom but walking into a negotiation he already believed he'd won. He stopped before the bench, and instead of the tentative nod most people offered, he gave Judge Caprio a slow, familiar dip of the head, the kind people reserve for someone they consider an equal, or someone they think they can read. The judge's smile softened, but his eyes sharpened, instinctively registering something offbeat. Caprio opened the file, preparing for the usual back and forth, when Alexei casually flicked his hand. A brisk, sideways sweep, interrupting, dismissing, correcting. In Russia, it might pass as a harmless one moment, but here, in a U.S. courtroom, it cut through the air like a sign of disregard. A ripple moved through the room. A few heads lifted. A woman whispered to her husband. Caprio lowered his glasses slightly. "Sir, let's keep things respectful." Alexei's expression didn't shift. His voice came low, even, almost indulgent. "Judge, I've dealt with much stricter men than you." No threat. No heat. Just a statement heavy with meanings no one could quite grasp. The atmosphere changed, not explosively, but like the quiet click of a lock sliding into place. Caprio returned to the file, and then paused. A line in the background section stood out like a red underline. Previous employment. Consultant for a foreign security organization. Country of origin. Russia. Status. Naturalized U.S. citizen. For the first time that morning, the judge's expression lost its morning warmth. He lifted his gaze slowly, studying the man who stood so calmly in front of him. No one spoke. The courtroom felt smaller, tighter, as though the walls were leaning in to listen. Alexei didn't look away. If anything, he seemed to brace himself, subtly tightening his jaw, straightening his stance, as if he recognized the moment the past finally caught up. A stray cough in the back row broke the silence, but the tension didn't ease. It simply settled deeper, like a shadow no one remembered seeing before. And in that quiet, the judge realized this was not just another parking violation. This was the beginning of a story that had walked into his courtroom long before Alexei Miller ever did. Judge Caprio folded his hands, choosing a tone as steady as the sea on a windless morning. "Mr. Miller," he began, "tell me what you do these days." Alexei's answer came clipped, almost rehearsed. "Financial consulting, independent work. I've lived here in Providence for a long time." The phrasing was casual, but something in it landed unevenly. Caprio glanced at the documents again. The file listed a different neighborhood entirely, one associated with people who rarely stayed longer than they had to. It was a detail easy to overlook, but for Caprio, it rang like a small bell somewhere in the background. Before he could ask more, the clerk slipped a note onto the bench. The judge opened it, and his eyebrows tightened a fraction. The complainant is present. Male, mid-70s. Veteran. Caprio looked up. A silver-haired man sat quietly in the second row, back straight, gaze fixed on Alexei. Not confrontational, not angry. Just watchful. The sort of steady vigilance that never fully leaves someone who has seen too much. The judge leaned slightly forward. "Let's revisit the incident," According to the report, there was an exchange between you and the complainant. Alexei's jaw tightened. I don't want to revisit it, he said, voice low. There are things better left alone. You wouldn't understand how quickly the past can revive itself. He spoke without drama, but the room shifted. His words carried the weight of someone who had lived with consequences invisible to the rest. Caprio kept his tone professional, though his eyes narrowed. This courtroom functions on clarity, not mystery. What happened? The veteran rose slowly, as if measuring whether speaking was worth the stir it might cause. When he finally addressed the judge, his voice was steady enough to quiet the room. He wasn't aggressive, the man said. He was cornered. I've seen that look before. People turned toward him, curious, uneasy. The veteran continued, his gaze never leaving Alexei. When I served overseas, some men carried fear like armor. Not fear of battle, fear of what trailed behind them. He has that same look. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even suspicion. It was recognition. Alexei's posture changed, just slightly, but enough for Caprio to notice the struggle behind the calm facade. A flicker of something vulnerable crossed his features before he smoothed it away, as though ashamed of having let it slip. Caprio returned to the file, tracing a line with his thumb. You lived in Russia until 1999. Your documents show a prior identity. Different spelling, different address, different history. Why such a drastic shift? For the first time, Alexei hesitated. Not because he lacked an answer, but because the truth hovered close and dangerous. He exhaled through his nose, eyes lowering. Because the life I had then does not belong here. And if I explain it fully, someone in this room may carry the weight of knowing too much. A hush rolled over the gallery. No dramatic reactions, just a heavy collective breath. The judge sat still, studying him, not as an adversary, not as a curiosity, but as a man standing at the intersection of who he was and who he pretended to be. And in that moment, everyone sensed it. This case wasn't drifting toward drama. It was sinking into truth. Judge Caprio turned to the screen as the clerk queued up the parking lot footage. Static flickered. Then the scene appeared. Rows of cars, the late morning light, and Alexei's vehicle pulled across two spaces at a sharp angle. But it wasn't the parking job that caught the judge's attention. A figure emerged from the edge of the frame, the veteran. He approached Alexei with a pace that wasn't confrontational, just purposeful. They exchanged a few quick words. The veteran's hand lifted slightly, palm forward, in a calming gesture. Alexei's shoulders stiffened. Then a short argument, 10 seconds at most, but the tension was palpable, even without sound. Caprio leaned back. Mr. Miller, what was said between you two? Alexei didn't look at the screen. It's irrelevant. The judge's tone shifted, still controlled, but with the unmistakable firmness of someone drawing a boundary that would not be crossed. You don't get to decide that. A quiet stillness settled, not fear, expectation. The veteran rose again, slower this time, as if stepping into terrain he had long avoided. He wasn't trying to start anything, Your Honor, the older man said. He was scared. I recognized it the moment I saw him. Eyes around the room followed him. The veteran's voice didn't waver, but there was a gentleness in it, something only age and hard years could polish. I served in Europe. You learn to read a man by how he stands when he thinks he's alone. He looked like someone waiting for trouble to find him. The room held its breath. Caprio turned back to Alexei. Your record shows significant changes beginning in 1999. A new home, new documents, new occupation. There are inconsistencies, small but noticeable. Why the reinvention? Alexei shifted his weight as if the floor itself had tilted. His practiced composure faltered for the first time. A faint tremor crossed his fingers before he clasped them together to still them. He spoke quietly, each word measured. I left that life behind because it was the only way to survive it. Explaining more won't help anyone here. Caprio closed the file gently, as though the matter inside required handling with care rather than force. But survival from what, Mr. Miller? A lawful citizen does not need to bury his past this deeply. Alexei looked up, and for a heartbeat the courtroom saw something raw. Guilt, perhaps, or the memory of choices that never fully loosened their hold. I lived under a system where silence was safety. That instinct doesn't just disappear because you cross a border. No theatrics, no attempt to win sympathy, just a truth spoken like a confession to no one in particular. The veteran's eyes softened, not with pity, but with recognition, like a man looking at someone who carried the same invisible scars, shaped in different lands, but born of the same heaviness. Caprio tapped his pen once, thoughtfully. Mr. Miller, this isn't a hearing about your former life, but your present behavior is influenced by something you refuse to name. A faint echo moved through the room, people shifting in their seats, suddenly aware that this wasn't just an unusual case. It was the unraveling of a life knotted by fear, loyalty, and whatever shadows still trailed behind him. Alexei lifted his gaze, and for the first time his voice lost its controlled neutrality. If I open that door, Judge, I can't predict who else it opens for. The room went silent again, and it became unmistakably clear. This was no longer about a parking violation. This was about the cost of a past that refuses to stay buried. Judge Caprio folded his hands again, but this time there was no gentleness in his posture, only patience sharpened by responsibility. Mr. Miller, he said evenly, people don't react the way you do over a parking dispute. There is something you're carrying that's influencing every answer. What is it? Alexei's silence stretched long enough for people to shift in their seats. He looked down, as though searching for words in the grain of the wooden podium. When he finally spoke, the words emerged with a weight that made the courtroom lean in. I was never an agent, he said. But I did cooperate with certain individuals who are now considered enemies of this country. Gasps rippled. Small, restrained, but unmistakable. Not fear. Not drama. Just the shock of hearing something so heavy in a room built for minor infractions. Alexei continued, voice steady but stripped of its earlier confidence. I wasn't involved in anything criminal here. Nothing against the United States. But the people I once worked around, they don't forget. And they don't forgive, even after decades. The tension didn't explode. It settled deeper, like a weight placed gently onto the room. The veteran's hand rose again. Judge, he said quietly, if I may. Caprio nodded. The veteran stood straight, though the years tugged at his shoulders. I didn't recognize him from a battlefield or from some intelligence list. I recognized the way he moves. Men who survive certain things. They walk like they're still listening for someone behind them. He paused, then added with a calm certainty. This is trauma, not treachery. The courtroom absorbed the words without judgment, just a slow dawning understanding that what stood before them wasn't a villain, but a man shaped by a life that never fully let him go. Judge Caprio reopened the folder, flipping to the financial review tucked behind the citation. A detail jumped out, a line that hadn't seemed significant earlier. Suspected use of a secondary address. Possible cause, avoidance of unidentified individuals. It was subtle, buried between formal phrases, but now it carried new meaning. Caprio looked up. Mr. Miller, are you running from someone? Alexei didn't hesitate this time. Yes. His voice held no fear, just resignation, like someone stating a fact he'd lived with for so long that the truth no longer had teeth. But not from any government, he added. From people tied to a past I cut myself out of. Leaving wasn't simple. Leaving was a risk. The room felt suspended, the way it does when someone admits something they've never said aloud. Caprio studied him, not to catch him in a lie, but to understand the man in front of him. You believe they might still be looking for you? Alexei exhaled, the sound quiet and tired. I know they are. That's why I move often. That's why I don't stay anywhere long. That's why I react the way I do. It's not anger. It's survival. The veteran lowered himself back into his seat, watching Alexei with an expression that wasn't sympathy, but respect, the kind given from one survivor to another. And in that moment, the courtroom didn't see a foreigner with a mysterious resume. They saw a man living under a shadow cast decades ago, still struggling to step out of it. Judge Caprio rested his palms on the bench, leaning forward just slightly, enough to show that he was no longer sifting through documents, but through character. Mr. Miller, he said, voice steady but without the earlier formality. I'm not here to judge your birthplace or your past. The only question before this court is simple. Did you break the law today? Alexei took a long breath, as though drawing air from a place deep within him. Yes, he said quietly. I was short-tempered. I reacted too fast. I didn't mean to cause trouble. But I don't trust uniforms. Any of them. It wasn't defiance. It was an admission. A plain truth laid bare without excuse or justification. Before the judge could respond, the veteran spoke again, this time without rising, as if the truth he carried didn't require the symbolic weight of standing. I know that feeling, he said. When I came home, even friendly faces looked like threats. It takes time to relearn peace. His tone wasn't sentimental. It was the voice of someone who had wrestled with his own shadows long before stepping into this courtroom. The gallery fell silent, not out of shock, but out of respect for the vulnerability suddenly hanging between three men who had lived entirely different lives, yet stood on shared ground for one fragile moment. Alexei's shoulders sagged, not in defeat, but in the way a person surrenders a weight they've carried alone for too long. If I explain my history in full, he murmured, I risk being found. That's not paranoia. It's experience. There were no dramatic gasps this time, only the quiet, collective realization that some fears are earned. Judge Caprio inhaled slowly, his expression thoughtful. Let me be clear, he said, each word measured. Your past may shape you, but it doesn't control what happens in this courtroom. Here, you stand as an individual, not as a symbol of a country, not as a rumor, not as a shadow. Alexei looked up, meeting the judge's eyes for the first time without that guarded stiffness. Caprio continued, his voice firm, but not harsh. You cannot bring the battles of your former life into this space. This is a place where the law protects people, not hunts them. If you want to rebuild trust, you must meet this country halfway. The room stayed utterly still. For a moment, Alexei didn't move. Then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Not a performative nod, not a gesture of compliance, a genuine acknowledgement, one that carried more weight than any apology could. The veteran offered him a small, almost invisible nod of his own, a soldier's affirmation, quiet and dignified. For the first time that morning, Alexei's posture softened, not relaxed, just less armored, as if a bolt in the metaphorical shield finally loosened. Judge Caprio concluded, his voice warm but unwavering. You've spent too long expecting danger at every corner, but you're not standing in the shadows now. You're standing in a courtroom, that believes in fairness. Don't mistake firmness for hostility. Something in the room shifted, subtle but profound. Not a resolution in the legal sense, but in the human sense. A small, fragile bridge built between fear, experience, and understanding. And though no one spoke, everyone felt it. Something inside Alexei Miller had finally begun to uncoil. Judge Caprio took one last look at the file before closing it with a quiet, decisive tap. The tension that had filled the room earlier had thinned into something gentler. Still serious, but no longer edged with fear. "Mr. Miller," he said, "your conduct today was unacceptable. You disrupted the peace, raised your voice, and disrespected an officer. But you've also explained enough for me to understand that your reactions came from reflex, not malice." He paused, letting the room settle around his words. "I'm reducing the fine," he continued, "but I'm adding a formal warning for disrespect toward the court. Consider it a reminder, not a punishment." There was no applause at first. People simply breathed, as though they had been holding their breath all along. Then a few soft claps rose from the back, not celebratory, but appreciative, an acknowledgement of balance restored. Alexei nodded once, the gesture small but sincere. "I understand," he said. "More than you know." As he gathered his things, the veteran rose from his seat and approached him quietly. He didn't extend a hand or offer a sympathetic smile, just stood close enough for Alexei to hear him. "If you need help," the older man murmured, "I'm around. No questions asked." Alexei froze for a brief second, not in fear, but in surprise. He gave a stiff exhale that carried more emotion than words ever could. "Thank you," he said softly. "I don't often hear that." The veteran shrugged, as if the gesture were nothing. "Most of us don't. That's why it matters." Alexei started toward the exit, but something made him stop at the doorway. He turned, looking back at the judge, not defiantly, not guardedly, just honestly. "Judge," he said, his voice calm but edged with an old familiar caution. "I appreciate the fairness and the respect, but—" He hesitated, searching for the right shape of the truth he wanted to leave behind. "You were right earlier. This isn't over." It wasn't a warning. It wasn't fear-mongering. It was simply the reality of a man who understood that the past doesn't fade just because someone else offers forgiveness. The doors closed behind him with a soft thud. For a moment, the courtroom felt suspended, like the silence that follows a final note in a long, stirring piece of music. Judge Caprio exhaled slowly, almost inaudibly, as he looked at the spot where Alexei had stood moments earlier. "I hope he finds his way," he murmured to himself. "No one deserves to live looking over their shoulder forever." There was no grand conclusion, no cinematic twist, just a quiet recognition that some stories aren't resolved in a courtroom. They continue on sidewalks, in dim apartments, in the quiet hours when old memories stir. The next case was called. But for everyone who had witnessed what unfolded, something lingered, a reminder that even a simple parking hearing can open a door into a life shaped by choices, losses, and the long shadow of a world left behind. A reminder that justice, in its most human form, is not only about rules, but about understanding.